So periodically, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we have been getting these intelligence reports from various European intelligence agencies talking about the fact that Russia might be preparing an attack on a NATO country. And each time we get a new report, there seems to be a higher level of certainty and a higher level of urgency. And just recently, we have gotten some of the most confident reports that we have heard yet, with Germany saying that they have basically irrefutable evidence that Russia is indeed planning an attack on a NATO country within the next 5 to 8 years. And this intelligence isn't just coming from German intelligence services, but also Denmark is corroborating this and saying very parallel statements. Now, in this case, what these intelligence agencies are currently warning of is actually rather chilling. It's not a full-scale Russian invasion of a NATO country. Not yet. That's not what the intelligence that they've released seems to indicate. But rather, it is a stepping stone to potentially pursue that. Where Russia is planning within the next 5 to 8 years, according to intelligence agencies, to test the NATO alliance and whether or not the various countries that make up NATO will actually come to each other's defense in the case of a real conflict. Now, for me personally, as I'll get into the details of later in this video, I find this scenario to actually be more chilling. Because to me, it seems much more realistic. Within the short term, there is really no way for Russia to actively engage in a war with a NATO country, because their resources are so fully engaged with Ukraine, and they have not yet managed to defeat Ukraine and don't appear to have a chance to do that anytime soon. However, if Russia were given a break from the war in Ukraine, if that war were to end for any reason, and Russia were able to rebuild or rearm for 5 to 10 years, conceivably their military could be back in a state where they feel comfortable enough actually fully attacking a NATO country. But the first step to that isn't a full-scale invasion. The first step to that is gathering information on how NATO actually responds under stress. So when I hear intelligence agencies saying that Russia plans to test the NATO alliance to see if it holds up to snuff over the next 5 to 8 years, that comes across to me as an incredibly credible and an incredibly realistic move that Russia might actually take, which makes it scarier than dramatic actions that they can't realistically take. And when I consider all of these scenarios and what Russia might do to test the NATO alliance, I worry, of course, about the Baltics, as everybody does, but I also worry specifically about Sweden. And the reason I have titled this video is Russia planning to attack Sweden is because I think of all of the non-obvious NATO countries that Russia might actually attack, Sweden is at the top of the list, and it's probably the thing we need to pay the most attention to. Now, some people might challenge me on that last point, and they might say Finland is actually more vulnerable than Sweden is because Finland actually borders Russia. But in my mind, while that is true, Sweden's significance is higher than Finland's, although Finland certainly isn't a zero-risk country. And the reason for that is because of Sweden's geographic positioning, and more specifically, the geographic positioning of a place called Gotland Island, which belongs to Sweden. Gotland Island is this large island that sits between Sweden and the Baltics, and is probably the most strategic position, at least in the Baltic area, if Russia were ever to engage in a war with NATO. Long story short, if Russia wants to control any NATO territory at all, they need to control Gotland Island. Gotland Island has been called basically Sweden's unsinkable aircraft carrier, and the reason it's called that is because it sits, sufficiently far from the Swedish coast to make it possible for aircraft to run missions from Gotland Island to the Baltic states relatively unencumbered. Whoever controls that island controls what goes on in the ocean around the Baltic states, and therefore controls supply lines to and from the Baltic states. In NATO's case, that means that if they control that island, if Sweden controls that island, they can easily defeat any Russian invasion of the Baltics because they will have the ability to get troops and supplies to the Baltics. In Russia's case, if they can disable Gotland Island and build up a buffer zone around that, they can potentially starve the Baltic states of support and bring them to a point where they are able to hold them long enough to actually fortify positions there and make it difficult to kick them out. So for that reason, Gotland Island is an essential piece of any Russian strategy to test NATO. And I don't believe that Russia can properly test NATO in any way, shape, or form without taking the step to take Gotland Island. What this means then is that in any case where Russia actually did decide to attack NATO, even to just test them, Russia would very likely be planning first strikes against Swedish military capabilities to, in their attempt of surprise attack, to take out as much Swedish military capabilities as they possibly could. And that might actually be one of their number one priorities. More of a priority than even nullifying the United States or Germany or Poland. Russia's strategies for those larger countries, which it could never hope to defeat militarily, is to disrupt them internally to make them less likely to actually fulfill their Article 5 obligations if they attack a different NATO country. Now, the reason I believe this is true for Sweden and not Finland is because of some fundamental differences between the two countries. I've already mentioned Gotland Island, but there's also a critical difference between Swedish and Finnish military capabilities. Now, for their size, both Sweden and Finland are extremely ferocious militarily. And frankly speaking, even though they're a small country, I'm not certain that Russia could successfully actually invade Finland, because though they're a small country, pretty much everybody in Finland knows how to fight, and they are prepared for the circumstance of a Russian invasion. But one thing Finland does not have is a powerful navy capable of projecting force very far beyond its coastal waters. It does have a navy, but it's specialized on coastal defense around Finnish waters specifically, while Sweden, on the other hand, has a powerful navy that is more focused on projecting power outwards outside of its borders. That means that if Russia is attacking the Baltics, Finland isn't as much of a threat. Sweden is. Sweden could conceivably do some real damage to their efforts, and they would likely be engaged with that, even if other major NATO countries chose to step back. And so Russia might do a first strike on Sweden to take out some of those capabilities, whereas they would probably attack Finland last because Finland is going to be extremely hard to defeat. And Finland also does not have the capability to project military force outside of its borders to the same degree as Sweden, even though Finland's military is very powerful. Long story short, Sweden is one of the most strategic military targets Russia actually has when it comes to NATO. And my fear is that while people have taken that threat seriously, they haven't taken it as seriously as maybe it should be taken. Now, to support all of these things I've said, I mentioned that Russia has actually taken some sabotage steps within Sweden that are also extremely concerning. And when it comes to Russia's hybrid warfare, Sweden has also been one of their major targets. That could be because of one of two things. It could be that Russia wants us to think that they will attack Sweden so that we divert resources there. Or it could be that Russia genuinely wants to attack Sweden and they want to test and poke and probe and see how Sweden and other NATO countries respond to hybrid attacks against Sweden. Some of the most concerning hybrid warfare attacks on Sweden are also the ones that have taken place the most recently And again, largely lining up with the statements from NATO intelligence saying that they believe Russia is indeed planning an attack on a NATO country. One of the more concerning attacks took place in March, where the water source for Gotland Island was sabotaged. And essentially, it was very clear it was sabotage. Nobody can prove it was the Russians yet, but we all pretty much know that they're the only ones with an incentive to do that. And then just a couple of days ago, there was an attack on Swedish telecommunications, where 30 different masts were attacked at the same time in what Swedish authorities are calling a coordinated strike. So if Russia were actually preparing the ground for an invasion of Sweden, these are the types of actions that they would take. First, undermining the infrastructure on Gotland Island to make it more vulnerable to siege, more likely to be abandoned if it's attacked, and second, against telecommunications equipment so that they can do a coordinated surprise strike against Swedish military targets, with them being hampered in their ability to respond because telecommunications were attacked. So all of these types of things, if Russia were legitimately planning to attack Sweden, are exactly the sorts of things that they would be doing to see what they could get away with and to see what they need to do in the future if they want to maybe do a repeat of these coordinated sabotage attacks right before an actual assault. So it is very concerning. So that being said, I've now laid out the strategic reasons why Russia might choose to attack Sweden. I've also laid out the hybrid warfare that shows that they are indeed attacking Sweden already, even if not directly militarily. So now what we should analyze is, what does this all mean and what's the most likely scenario? Is it actually possible that Sweden is included in these targets that Russia wants to attack potentially soon, potentially within 5 to 8 years? Or is there a different option? Now, I personally currently lean towards a different option, especially for the short term, though over a longer time horizon, I don't exclude at all the possibility that Russia might be preparing to invade Sweden within 5 to 10 years, but certainly not tomorrow. The reason I say that I would go for a different option is that currently Russia is simply in no position to expand its war. It is trying to expand its war within Ukraine, and it can't even do that. The last thing Russia is going to do right now at this moment is actually attack a NATO country and stretch itself too thin. I mean, theoretically, they could do it, but that would represent a level of incompetence and desperation that I don't even think that Russia has. Now, even more than that, even under perfect circumstances, Russia would definitely struggle to capture Gotland Island in the first place. And that's because Russia's navy isn't exactly known for being the most stellar in the world. If we look at their Black Sea fleet, it was essentially decimated by Ukraine that doesn't even have a navy. And Sweden definitely has a navy. They even have this really exciting, cool technology called submarines. And Russia only has, the last I checked, in its entire fleet, approximately 20 naval vessels that are actually capable of landing troops. And a lot of those naval vessels are in the Black Sea, which has no way of getting up to the Baltic Sea to prepare for an invasion of Gotland Island. So if Russia was trying to invade Gotland Island, they would have a very small number of ships that they could actually use to do that sort of invasion. And we all know that land invasions take a whole lot of resources. Look at D-Day and the number of troops that were used there. And they have such a small number of ships that could do this that Sweden would very clearly see coming on their way, that Sweden could just sink most, if not all, of these ships before they ever even reached the shores of Gotland Island in the first place, which makes that objective basically impossible for Russia to actually achieve. And that applies in the short term and also more towards the long term, unless Russia takes very serious steps to actually build up troop transports. And if they did that, Sweden would know about that well ahead of time, and they would have plenty of time to prepare. So with that in mind, we I think, for the short term, should look at Russia's sabotage and hybrid warfare attacks in a different angle, which is how do these attacks help Russia in the short term? And they help Russia in the short term in two ways. First, what they do is they give Russia information on what they can get away with, because for every act that gets caught, a lot don't. And they are developing capabilities that they can potentially use in the future. And they're also getting information on how individual countries respond when they are sabotaged or hit by other types of hybrid warfare from Russia. Russia also, right now, while they're engaged in war with Ukraine, has an incentive to sort of tip other NATO nations off that they might be planning to attack them, which is potentially why they do such obvious kinds of sabotage. Because when this sabotage is going on, countries like Sweden are forced for their own defense to take a more conservative stance to aid that they might otherwise have given to Ukraine. And they're forced to hold more back for their own individual use. Because even if the likelihood of Russia attacking soon is really small, it's not zero. And so that helps Russia out, at least in their eyes, by preventing countries from sending more support to Ukraine, which could derail their current war efforts. So under that horizon, it is possible that maybe this credible evidence that intelligence agencies have about Russia planning to attack Baltic states was intentionally leaked by Russia to those intelligence agencies. But at the same time, I think those intelligence agencies are more than capable of figuring that out for themselves, and they likely wouldn't release that information to the public if that's what they thought was the case. However, whichever of these scenarios turns out to actually be true, the message for the general public is actually identical. Because whether Russia is planning to attack the Baltic states tomorrow, and that's why they're doing sabotage, or whether Russia is trying to pull people off the scent to remove support from Ukraine, the actions that the general public can take remain the same. The general public needs to understand that Russia is actively engaged in hybrid warfare, which includes sabotage within European countries. It also includes disinformation and propaganda to try to take countries off the chessboard as playing pieces as much as possible. It includes efforts to influence the minds and the thinking of average, ordinary people, both to be more on Russia's side or to fear Russia so much that they don't want to provoke them and risk harm coming to themselves or their country. And the thing that public needs to do is recognize that these are the strategies that Russia is using. And when you recognize that these are the strategies Russia is using, they're no longer scary. They're just annoying and frustrating. And you can actually start fighting back against them and undermining Russia's attempts to hurt innocent people, which I think is a really cool thing to do. Another thing to keep in mind is that while Russia is engaged with Ukraine, they cannot start a war with anybody else that they actually have a chance of winning. And so with that in mind, we should not pull back from Ukraine. We should support Ukraine as long as they are willing to continue fighting against Russia, because supporting Ukraine also supports every other country that is a part of NATO. Now, I know all of my audience already knows those things, but a reminder is always helpful. With that in mind, I'm going to close out the video. But before you go, if I could ask you for a quick favor. If you found this analysis insightful or helpful, would you consider becoming a patron and supporting my work? It's completely voluntary. It's just for people who want to support the channel to have a way to do so. And you can learn more by scanning the QR code on screen or visiting the link in the description of this video. Thanks for watching as always. I'll see you guys on the next one.